Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to our webinar today, titled Decoding AI, the Myths, Facts and the Future. Today in this webinar, we're going to be focusing in on AI, understanding a little bit about the journey of how AI has got to where it is in the modern day now today, and then also starting to zoom in on how we can look at this from an organizational perspective and how businesses can start to think differently about how they might start adopting AI. In terms of our speakers today, you have myself, who is the head of data science for Adatis, which is part of the Telefónica Tech family. I myself spend a lot of time talking to customers about how they can kickstart and kind of adopt AI as part of their ongoing transformation journey. And we also have our friend from Microsoft, Cindy, who is a technical specialist, who's going to be kicking off our webinar and talking to us about how AI has kind of progressed into what we now know as sort of AI in the modern world. In terms of our agenda, so as I say, we have a sort of the story so far of AI, how we've progressed so far with AI and the kind of modern things that we're seeing with AI at the moment. We'll then start to talk about how we can leverage that AI in its modern way into becoming a data-driven organization, and what that means for analyzing and using your data to the most, but also leveraging tools like AI to get the maximum amount out of your data. We'll then look at three different perspectives of AI that are relevant to all organizations and how organizations can start thinking about using AI in different ways depending on the different business benefits they're looking to get. We'll then move into a demo of an accelerator tool that Adatis have built, which allows us to demonstrate and show organizations and customers the different types of patterns they might want to utilize around generative AI and how they can start to begin working with those very, very quickly and easily. And then we'll talk about how we can help you in your next steps with your AI journey. At the end of that agenda, we should have time for a brief Q&A session, which I believe you can put your questions into the Q&A box that should be in the GoToWebinar page, and we'll try and get through as many questions as those as we can at the end. So without further ado, I will pass on to Cindy from Microsoft, who's going to talk to us about AI, the story so far.
Good morning, everyone. Actually, no, it's afternoon now. It is 4 minutes past noon, so good afternoon, everyone. And I bet that you were not signing up for a history lesson when you signed up to this webinar, but I'm going to give you one anyway. So this is a very brief look at what AI has become over the last 50 years or so. And actually, the first time it was coined in published documents is actually in 1956, where the field of computer science sought to create intelligent machines, essentially that could essentially replicate human intelligence, and that's when the term artificial intelligence first was coined. You may or may not have heard of the Turing test, so that is named after our beloved Alan Turing. And essentially that is the test whether or not you can tell if a machine is actually a machine or if it's human. So I'll get to it in a little bit, but I think most generative AI solutions now can actually pass the Turing test, but it's been a long journey since it was conceived. So in 1997, machine learning as we know it, which is a subset of AI that allows machines to basically learn from data, that started to be kicked off by our researchers and a lot of the computational scientists in the world. And essentially it takes data and lots of data to understand how humans make decisions and then use those algorithms to make predictions. And then in 2012, a deep learning technique consisting of neural networks was actually conceived of, and essentially that laid the foundations for what is generative AI today, and that's your chat GPTs of the world. And neural networks are all of these convoluted, essentially networks, and that are used to take machine learning even further. And so essentially deep learning is often known as black box models because they're so hard to explain, but those are the foundations that allow generative AI to exist today. And generative AI is different because not only does it take data and it makes predictions, but actually now generative AI can do exactly that, which is generate things. It can generate new text, visuals, audio. So this journey relies upon a lot of different, I think, milestones. So Matt, if I could ask you kindly to go to the next slide. And I won't go into too much detail about what those milestones are, but starting in 2016, we consider human parity as the milestones and the breakthroughs of research for all of these different categories. So in 2016, it starts with object recognition. So if you show the machine a dog, it categorizes what a dog is, and then it slowly morphs into human parity for speech recognition. So the fact that I'm talking to you in human language, that's a lot of the speech recognition capabilities of AI. So understanding reading was the next step. How can we actually read natural language and then also comprehend it? So if you've ever taken an exam in reading comprehension, all of those same mechanisms were now taught to the machine. And then machine translation became the next step. So how do we take one language and translate it into another? Following that, we have the conversational element. So it's no longer just text to text, but how do you understand a conversation? How do we, what is memory? What is a conversation history? We move away a little bit from the NLP bit, so that's the natural language processing bit, into images. And so understanding what is in an image, that came in 2020. So if I showed you a picture of a scene from, let's say, Titanic, it would understand what a boat is, where the humans are, and so on and so forth. Going back to natural language understanding in 2021, it takes conversational Q&A to the next level in the sense that it starts to really converse, the machine starts to converse with humans there. Common sense question answering is another one that you think about when it comes to holding a conversation with the machine. Can you actually make sense of what that machine is trying to say? And so in 2021 and 2022, sometime between there, I would say the Turing test was passed, and that's where ChatGPT, as you know it, comes from. So the idea that the AI algorithms are now good enough to mimic humans in a way that you can no longer discern between humans and machine. So enough with the history lesson. If I can ask Matt for another slide move. So essentially, OpenAI is what we consider the creme de la creme of GPT, or sorry, not GPT, but these large language models, and they are known for their GPT 3.5, 4, and you might be most familiar with ChatGPT. So these models are built by OpenAI and essentially can pass a lot of exams. I appreciate these exams are US based, but essentially these are collegiate level exams that now AI has been able to pass in, the 90th or above percentiles. And what that means is that it's no longer a challenge for AI to achieve human parity. So now we think about how can we use it to assist humans rather than, let's say, just replace them. Next slide, please. And just to give you an understanding of what these models can do is the understanding that they took so many billions of data points to really get to the understanding of what it takes to be human and to achieve human parity. So you can see from 2018 all the way to 2023, these are the large language models that are most commonly used. You'll see GPT on there, but you'll also see others, for example, from Google, Meta, or NVIDIA and Anthropic, and they all function in slightly different ways, but have the same basis that they are multimodal and also multitask, and they interact with the human. Next slide, please. And this is a bit of a gratuitous picture just to show you what it takes for it all to exist. So sometimes we forget about the fact that AI is also not only in the cloud or only virtual, but it has a heavy physical imprint as well. So this is one of the hyperscale infrastructure data centers that NVIDIA has, and you can see it's massively under construction. So all of these are being built around the world to funnel into GPT and well, all of the other LLMs as well. And I think it's important to remember that while AI can do a lot of good, it is also, it leaves a heavy carbon footprint as well. So thinking about how do we use it for good, how can we offset said carbon footprint is something that we at Microsoft consider a lot. And that's why we have a close partnership with OpenAI. So actually OpenAI and Microsoft partner in order to bring GPT-4 and beyond, and all of these other models on the bottom that you see there, to the end user. And essentially what that means is we allow organizations to wrangle GPT and use GPT in an enterprise scenario, and we also put a lot of funding to make sure that good comes out of it and not, for lack of better words, evil. And if we go into the next slide, we have many responsible AI principles that we work together with OpenAI on. And so essentially that's privacy and security, inclusiveness, accountability, transparency, fairness, reliability, and safety. And essentially all of these things contribute heavily to what we consider is a responsible use of AI. It's not only important that we use AI to help, well, us continue to, let's say, innovate and create, but we also need to do it in a way that is, well, all these things above is responsible use. So whenever we engage with our customers, and our partners have the same as well, we always make sure to ask not only can it be done, but should it be done? And so with that, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Matt again, who will take you through the rest of the journey. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Cindy. That's been great to have that sort of understanding of how AI has come through and the different things that we need to be aware of at that level. So I think building on what Cindy said, we're now starting to understand that, you know, in days gone by, AI was a much more technical subject focused on by sort of technical parts of a business or an organization, predominantly by sort of IT or maybe the data function within IT. But still very much a kind of a technical implementation piece that had sort of little to do with potentially the sort of more executive level of an organization. What we're seeing over that journey that Cindy's just described is that more and more the kind of the gap between what people are trying to achieve with AI and actually how realistic those is and how comprehensible that is for execs and senior business leaders is starting to really, really shrink now. And so, you know, as we're starting to revolutionize and have these things like responsible AI frameworks and starting to think about things like the sustainable and carbon footprints around AI, that conversation is becoming less and less technical and more focused at the sort of top level of organizations, at the sort of the C-suite of businesses. So where have all these kind of technical terms around kind of machine learning and data lakes and all these kinds of things in the past are now kind of morphing into more things like data storytelling and establishing data culture and data fluency and things like this. So the conversation around AI is really starting to mature and develop into something that an entire cross-section of organizations are starting to have, as opposed to just being a very technical topic that's only focused on by small parts of an organization. And as we sort of start to see that conversation evolve, we're seeing the kind of evolution of the role of sort of chief data officers, or for example, the role of a CTO or a CIO starting to incorporate elements of data into their day-to-day role. It's really, really important to understand that as we're trying to establish that sort of AI capability, we have to have these sort of roles across the business that can have these conversations and start to tease out these kinds of ideas in the right format. So as kind of organizations are starting to go on that journey and maybe starting to appoint their first kind of data focused roles like chief data officers, for example, what generally tends to happen is that where in a sort of a previous organization, maybe doing sort of some sort of analytics or some sort of reporting or even some sort of machine learning or data science, but potentially in slightly an ungoverned way, essentially a cottage industry that there are these little isolated pockets of kind of capability, but they're not properly governed across the entire organization. So in order to get a handle on that and start to scale those kind of capabilities, the first thing that has to happen is to input some sort of governance and kind of centralize that capability so that we can standardize the way that these things are working. And initially, this might feel like a bit of a step back. It might feel like things are starting to slow down because sort of the rate of innovation has been slightly hampered by the need to have some more controlled governance around it. So this is what we call that controlling governance, which takes us into that slight dip on the graph on the left-hand side. What we then find is actually those guardrails and sort of putting in those right foundations help to enable and empower the users to have more capabilities and fundamentally use data better and democratize those skills across the organization because we've got that central foundation in place that's so key. And from there, we can then accelerate further still so that the entire business community is starting to be liberated with those skills and the right tools and capabilities to make data work for them and fundamentally utilize that data to really help them with their day-to-day tasks. And that's what we call that liberating governance, where we're really starting to accelerate and fly with data. And navigating us through that journey is where we see the role of these kind of chief data officers or the kind of more data-focused CTOs and CIOs, helping us kind of navigate that sort of initial dip, but then moving into that rate of acceleration. And of course, there's a number of layers to these things. For example, data, all organizations have data. It's just a kind of a byproduct of any work that we do. We're always going to generate data or utilize data in some form. So that's always a given. There will always be data. The things that we can choose and kind of slightly leverage is the other aspects that sort of wrap around that data. So for example, at a very simple level, there's technology. How do we get access to that data? What technology do we use to actually interact with that data? Are we, recommending the use of kind of more technical SQL queries to go and interrogate that data? Or do we want something a bit more friendly, like Power BI and reporting dashboards, for example? And making sure that technology is scalable. So if we're looking at very large volumes of data, have we got something that can handle that in a performant way, but can also go right down to sort of much more fine-tuned single point access query type options? So making sure we've got that range and that scalability is really important when we want to try and leverage things like machine learning and kind of data sharing, those kind of technologies. Once you've got those technologies in place, it's all about then enabling users to start using those technologies to get access to the data. And whilst this is partially about just putting the tools in front of the right people, we need to have the sort of peripheral elements to go around that. Things like establishing business glossary and proper data governance tools, and even things like understanding different KPI frameworks are helping people to understand what they can get from that data and how they should be interacting with it and what they can expect to get out of that data in terms of helping them with their roles and their day-to-day lives. And as more and more people start to use that data and see the benefits of those business glossaries and KPI frameworks, it's really important to have that layer of guardianship to go around that, to make sure that we are upholding the value of our data and making sure that we're accountable to that data and making sure that it's delivering the value that we're expecting to see. And of course, none of this happens without sponsorship, directive, and fundamentally momentum to make sure that these things and all these layers are properly catered for. So we need that sort of people element to make sure that we can navigate this journey and get all those layers properly functioning. And once we have those layers properly functioning and all kind of interacting and all working as a cohesive organization that has that data fluency and that established data culture, there's so many incredible things that we can start to look at from an organizational perspective. Things like starting to make properly data-backed decisions so that we can fundamentally say we know we're making a good decision because we've got the data to support that particular choice. But also unlocking sort of new relationships or links between different parts of your organization. By having a common data platform, it allows organizations to start integrating their different parts of their business in new ways, which can often unlock new kind of untold insights about how certain parts of that business may function and start to give benefits from that perspective. We can also get deeper business knowledge so we can understand our organization better. We can understand how we perform in certain scenarios or what kind of seasonality might be affecting parts of our business. So we can start to track these trends and really get into another level of understanding about how our business functions. And of course, it's the hot topic at the moment. We can start to leverage things like generative AI or even indeed other kind of advanced analytical capabilities such as machine learning and data science. But these things fundamentally operate best when they've got the foundational layers in place. So moving on to sort of the topic now focused on this generative AI piece. when an organization starts to think about generative AI, it's quite a difficult map to navigate. There's a lot of different AI providers out there. There's a lot of different ways to purchase AI. It's quite a confused marketplace. So organizations need to understand, what does AI actually give me as an organization? What am I looking to get out of some AI initiative or solution? And the way that we think is best to kind of carve this up at a high level is looking at the three different perspectives of AI that an organization might be trying to leverage. So the first one is looking at AI from a personal productivity perspective. And this includes tools like ChatGPT, but also things like Copilot in Microsoft 365 or Copilot for Windows. The idea, the fundamental sort of proposition behind these tools is to allow individuals to be more productive in a personal way. And we'll talk more about some of those things in just a minute. The next one is then more sort of zooming out and focusing more of an organizational level. So how can we use things like the partnership between Azure and OpenAI, or things like Copilot Studio, to actually make our organization more efficient, do things better, but not just for individuals at a department level or organizational scale. And then the last kind of perspective on AI is really where organizations are purchasing AI capabilities, but as part of a box product, if you like. You buy a kind of a software as a service package, and you'll likely get some sort of AI that's built into that helps kind of augment the way that you use that particular piece of software. And a classic example is Dynamics 365, which nowadays has specific copilots baked into it. But you see this in other software as a service providers as well. So to sort of zoom in on these then for a minute or two. So when we talk about AI tools for personal productivity, as I mentioned, we've got things like the Copilots from Microsoft, but also things like the ChatGPT, tool that Cindy mentioned at the start. So of course, these are embedded tools. That's kind of fundamentally their proposition, is that they are embedded into the tools that we as individual kind of information workers, we use day in, day out. So they're right there at our fingertips, ready to be used. So to make us more productive, we can do that right within the tool that we're using, right within Excel or Word or Outlook or PowerPoint. We've got the tool right there for us to use. Ideally, we want to try and make tasks quicker. So we want to be able to generate content quicker, for example, or summarize documents quicker. We want to try and speed up the work that we're doing so that all workers are more efficient. So yeah, definitely the focus is making quicker and simpler the things that we're trying to do. Of course, these are focused on individuals and can be then slightly sort of non-deterministic based on how an individual has their user profile set up, or how the particular persona and kind of security permissions are configured. So you may find that actually similar prompts or similar sort of activities in the same tool will actually look very differently for different users. So it's important to be mindful of the fact that these things may perform differently for different users. And of course, it's quite hard to measure the ROI of these tools, the return on investment, because they really depend on the individual's usage. So you may find that some users are more adept to things like prompt engineering and working with these kind of copilots and these experiences to build up a response. And you may find that some users struggle more with that paradigm and can't quite use those tools to their maximum efficiency. So mileage will vary depending on the user, but they're focused on the user. So it's really important that those users are upskilled and are given the knowledge to use those tools most effectively. The next one then is focusing on AI tools for organizational enhancement. So as I mentioned here, this is focusing then less on the sort of individual, but more on the organizational breadth we might be looking at. So things like the Azure OpenAI services give us a set of large language model capabilities built into Azure, which we can then start to build services, capabilities, apps and solutions around that have those large language models baked into them. And similarly, from a low or no code perspective, we have things like Copilot Studio, which allow us to build out very similar kind of chatbot, knowledge bot style experiences, but again, focused around sort of broader organizations as opposed to individuals. So these are tools that are in place to help organizations leverage AI capabilities, but at that much more enterprise scale. Of course, we can highly customize the solution, the experience now, as opposed to getting an experience that is fixed inside of PowerPoint or Word or something like that. We can now customize what these services do. We can start to customize the different prompts that might be going in at the back, and how these kind of services actually interact with those large language models. So the focus now is on not just individuals, but the scale and the capability to support specific use cases across the business. So whilst these may not be as closely embedded into the applications that our business use day in, day out, we can use better KPIs and success metrics to measure their ROI a bit more effectively. So they do have a slightly more compelling use case from that perspective. And the last one then is, as I say, AI tools for sort of more commercial use. So again, a classic example being Dynamics 365, where if you're a subscriber to the Dynamics 365 model, you can use things like Copilot for Sales, Copilot for Customer Service, or Copilot for Customer Insights. And these are a specific set of tools that help you do your job, but you are sort of given the out-of-the-box experience of using the AI services as they arrive in Dynamics. So they're not necessarily a specific generative AI service, but they're more tailored around the specific service, e.g. sales or customer service that you're trying to do, and giving you AI tools that help with that, help augment that core service. So obviously their focus is to better experience or give a better experience to those licensed users. But usually there is a additional cost incurred on top of a license to make sure that you can get the most out of those generative AI capabilities. So when we think about some of the different use cases, this just helps to sort of articulate those different perspectives on AI and what the kind of an organization trying to do one thing might look at one type of AI versus another. So talking about personal productivity for a second, giving your users the ability to transcribe the calls that they've been on or summarize those in a more efficient way, or even subscribe to the calls. They don't necessarily have to join every call, but they can still be updated on the content of that call. It's going to make them more efficient because they can start to consume that information in a more scaled out way. Of course, for those that have to create documents or create content of any kind, really, giving them those generative AI capabilities is going to massively increase the rate at which they can iterate and generate that content. So those individuals that are tasked with generating that can do that much, much more efficiently. And also those that may need to sort of retype information from one system into another, AI can lend support in terms of processing that data from one thing to another, doing things like document scanning and form population to make those things more efficient for those individuals. As I say, those are focused on how you can make individuals more effective. But also we've talked about this concept of organizational enhancement. So we could look at things like automated support services. So how can we use AI to actually give things like first line support a boost in our organization? So this is not just benefiting one individual from a licensing perspective, but we can now benefit our entire organization by embedding AI into our support services and helping to route those different support tickets to the right teams and making those more efficient with the help of AI. We could also look at document processing and assessment, particularly in things like the insurance industry, where there is a lot of processing of things like claims documents and this kind of thing. We can start to automate those at scale so that entire departments and entire processes that sort of fuel the business are made much, much more efficiently and can obviously generate much more revenue through to that efficiency saving. Things like automated sentiment analysis, so looking at customer reviews and automating the sentiment analysis that goes behind that can be very effective, or looking at how customers behave with your business and whether they may be looking to move to another provider or potentially churn away from your business can be a very interesting insight when you're looking at marketing activities. And the last piece then is around commercial use. So some use cases here might be empowering sort of sales or commercial folks to understand what should be the next, what is the recommended next step with that particular customer. If they're just taking this particular action, how should I respond to that to try and get the maximum out of that particular engagement? Also, a lot of tools nowadays are able to generate automated customer profiles. So by scanning through your database of customers and building out better information and knowledge bases around those customers so that staff using those particular services are much more informed about that customer and what might be going on for that customer in their broader context, not just within your sort of scope of the relationship you have with that particular customer. And of course, it's a really big one at the moment, particularly with the events going on this week, but understanding cyber threat detection and understanding how those threats are sort of permeating our everyday lives and being able to detect those early using AI to help us understand that. So when we think about these different perspectives on AI, of course, some of these things are slightly easier to affect than others. For example, if we plot these onto this sort of grid that balances off the kind of impact that these perspectives can have versus how easy they are to adopt, personal productivity is obviously relatively easy to adopt because we can turn it on in the products and services that people are already using. inside their kind of well-known applications. But unless we really scale that out, we're not going to have that really sort of broad, cross-cutting organizational impact that we can really track that RAI from. So great for individuals, but really needs that scaling out to get those broader benefits. Sort of in the middle is this kind of commercial use perspective, whereby we're kind of focusing on specific and relevant use cases, so we can sort of build those into the software that we may be using. But there is a risk that potentially they are slightly too generic because they're built out by a generic software as a service provider. So fine-tuning those to your specific business processes may mean there is slightly more work to go into that kind of adoption cycle. And so lastly, then we have these organizational enhancement pieces, whereby they have the power and ability to be really, really effective at changing the way that organization goes about their business. But to get those right and adopted and really sort of working properly within an organization can be a little bit more strenuous. There's more effort needed to get those adoptions in place. So now we've understood a little bit about these different perspectives of AI, what I'm going to do is talk you through an Adatis-built AI accelerator, which allows us to look at some of the different use cases that organizations may have around AI, demonstrate them out and prove that they can function properly within inside that organization using their data. And then we can then use that to then help kickstart a project or a pilot piece of work, pilot project, for example, with those customers to help them kind of really fundamentally get off the ground with AI use cases. So just to briefly set the context here then. So as an overview of our Azure OpenAI Accelerator, it's really built out to do three kind of core things. So the first thing is to provide a simple interface over some of the Azure AI services. So in Azure, we have many different AI-focused services. The three that we're really interested that sort of relate to generative AI at the moment are things like the Azure OpenAI service, Document Intelligence, and Azure AI Search. So our interface allows us to interact with all these services in a really seamless, joined-up way, so that users don't have to sort of navigate around the Azure portal trying to find all the different services they're looking for. It gives them that joined-up experience over all of those and unifying them into that cohesive solution. Next up is really about establishing a couple of core knowledge-based management capabilities. So this is all about now taking raw, unstructured document data and turning it into something that is highly queryable and highly intuitive to start working with from a user perspective. So this can be starting to extract things like key terms from document data, doing things like sentiment analysis, and fundamentally kind of classifying what those documents might look at, but also encoding that data so that it's now in a machine readable format and can be then optimized with things like search queries using things like vectors and embeddings to make sure that when we start using large language models over the top of that, we can get the most out of that information. And then lastly, we wanted to be able to establish a set of basic and generic sort of information retrieval patterns. So the two that we focused on in this particular accelerator are first of all, retrieval augmented generation. So the retrieval augmented generation pattern allows us to take a user query and then understand what that query is really looking at from a semantic perspective and find the most relevant documents from our document database, from our unstructured data. We can then pair up the context that we get from our document database with the capabilities of a large language model to give the user a much more informed response. So now we're not just utilizing the sort of pre-trained information from the internet that we all know that ChatGPT has been trained on. We're able to sort of enhance that with our own knowledge and even limit it to our own knowledge so that the user has a much more intuitive and sort of relatable response. And also, you know, for those familiar with the ChatGPT experience, that sort of chatbot where we have a query, we get an answer, we may want to then ask follow-ups and sort of iterate on that context as a way of searching through our bid library to try and use that as a research tool to find out more and more information about the content of our particular bid library. So now that I've set the context of what our AI accelerator does, I'm going to dive into a quick live demo. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my screen. This is our sort of our chatbot page, whereby we have established a chatbot capability. As you can see, we can put in our information here and we can interact with our chatbot. The other thing I'll say at the moment is that our chatbot has been sat now on top of a particular knowledge base. So rather than being a generic ChatGPT type chatbot, we've told it to start using data from a knowledge base that we've pre-set up. So we can start to query this knowledge base now and get more and more information from our knowledge base using this chatbot. And we can start off with some fairly basic prompts. For example, what is our approach to cost estimation? And this could be really useful from someone that's just starting to join the business, wanting to learn a bit more about how we go about certain processes. So we can start to query the bot and query that information to find out that response. And we can see here that we use estimates are associated with data science environments. We divide projects into phases, and we estimate each phase separately. So it's a fairly accurate response based on the bid content that we've used, but explains how we go about estimating costs. As mentioned, we could also start using this as more of a research tool. So we could start to ask things like, well, which industry sectors have we completed projects for? If I'm building out bid responses, for example, I might want to know what are our core target sectors that we've worked in. So I can fire this off into my bot, and it will come back and tell me that we've worked in a variety of different industry sectors, for example, the public sector, education, healthcare, retail, commercial verticals. So it's answered my response and told me which sectors that we've kind of worked in. Another thing that we can do then is we might want to start to understand, well, what is the context? How is it finding that information? How do I know that this is correct? How do I validate that particular response? So what we're able to do actually is use our kind of context button here, which tells us the different chunks of data that were used in order to generate that response. So we can actually go through and verify that the information that it's giving us is correct and accurate, and also giving us a sort of a match percentage to how relevant that information was. As I say, we can also start to iterate then on these responses. For example, if I was particularly interested in public sector, I could say, well, let me find out a bit more about our public sector responses. So tell me more about the work done in the public sector. And I can now start to double click on some of those responses, and the bot can maintain that context, start to give me further information about those particular public sector customers. For example, local government, health trusts, and other public sector organizations. That's really good. So it's a really nice way of actually interrogating our bid library and using this as a research tool to help us actually get more and more information from our bid library. We can also then use this to start generating responses in a slightly different way. So for example, here, if we want to start using this tool to help us with sort of proposal management and creating content for things like bid responses, then we've got this kind of interface set up to help us with that particular process. So if I take a sort of a relatively standard bid question, I can put this in here. Notice I can also augment my my prompt here by saying things like, I want the heading structure or subheading structure to answer this question, and some initial draft content under each heading and subheading. So this gives me much more opportunity to be more direct with my prompt as opposed to just interacting with a chatbot. You can see I've chosen the answer option there, and I can then go and ask my my service to go and generate me a response to this particular question. Okay, so it's done a fairly good job. It's generated for me the headings and the subheadings, which kind of answer the question about how we go about our cost estimation process. I've also mentioned in that question about making sure that risks are accounted for. So we can see that things like regular updates and contingency plans are all kind of leaning into the fact that we're going to be covering off various different risks. Should I want to then iterate on this particular response, I can then put that back into my source text input. And I could say, for example, well, I'd actually quite like to have something around dependency management, for example. So I could put in another title around that. Send that off. And what I'll get now is a nice paragraph which will tell me about how Adatas might approach dependency management. So you can start to see how we can begin to iterate on these responses and start to build out these responses as and when we want to sort of build those out for RFPs or bid content. We've also got a range of other capabilities in here. So we can obviously extract things like key entities from these different responses, and we can redact things like customer information, or we can begin to actually elaborate should we want to add more words, or summarize if we want to remove words, and even start to rewrite these in past or future tense. These kind of one-click capabilities are highly customizable to the different scenarios or use cases that an organization might be looking at, but we can build those in to help do the things that you do more often very, very quickly. Also, we can start to add additional context. So should we want to add in particular win themes or particular client references, or potentially even references to specific documents, we can add that in as additional context. And the bot will then understand that as and when it's generating out responses across an entire RFP process, for example, that you want to include a win theme around innovation, for example. And it will start to thread those kind of concepts into the responses that are made. We also have some sort of knowledge-based management capabilities, as I mentioned just previously. For example, we want to search our knowledge base. We can quite easily do that by searching kind of keywords in here. For example, data warehousing. And I can see I've got all my sort of information that is relevant to data warehousing here. So I could go through that, and again, I can use this as a bit of a research tool to go and find all the content that's relevant to data warehousing that I might want to include in some of my RFP responses. And of course, if I need to then add more information to my knowledge base, I can also do that as well by choosing any location within my Azure environment. I can choose a particular container, choose a particular document that I want to process, and then I can then choose a different chunking strategy, so how it's going to break that document up as it stores it in the database. And then I can then process that into my database. So if I've got a new bid that I've just completed, I can then very easily upload that and put it into my knowledge management solution. So I've got the ability to then use that in future content generation processes. The last thing as well, we also service a little bit of kind of configuration. So you can choose different databases or different collections, which allow you to really refine how you want to structure and break up that data. If you have things like data residency concerns, or the data needs to be kind of logically separated, you've got the ability to do that. We can also set how many items are returned and whether we want to use that vector database or simply just use ChatGPT in its kind of native format. And the last thing here is we have the option to adjust the temperature, which essentially tells the large language model how much randomness to throw in as you generate a response. So 0 being sort of no randomness, all the way up to 2, which gives us kind of the most amount of randomness possible. And that will give us the amount of kind of creativity that gets thrown into those responses. So I hope that's been an interesting look at the AI accelerator that we've built and how we can use that to help organizations kickstart their AI journey by implementing those generative patterns, but also some of those basic knowledge-based management capabilities. So I'm going to jump back to the slides now. So the last thing I want to cover off then is a brief overview of the different approaches that we can use to help organizations get started on their AI journey. And these really split down into a technical piece and a non-technical piece. So this particular one that we're looking at the moment is called our AI Readiness Kickstarter. And the goal of this is to really help organizations find out all the facts and all the information they need to kind of go on their AI journey, embark upon that sort of that road to AI adoption. So the first piece is about an AI impact assessment. So understanding how AI is going to impact your particular organization. For example, we as a Datis, we write a lot of code to build out the solutions that we deliver for our customers. And as we have more and more capabilities coming from generative code gen tools, for example, like GitHub Copilot, we may need to be aware of the impact of those types of tools, about how much code that we may need to write versus using generative tools like GitHub Copilot. So we really need to understand the impact, both negative and positive, around these kind of generative AI capabilities and how they might change the way that our organization needs to function to make the most out of these tools. We also use a process called AI solution envisioning, where we can take individual use cases that come out of things like the impact assessment and start to dive deeper into those as individual use cases. So here we start to understand firstly what the value proposition is, what makes this use case worth embarking upon, and also some of the kind of the success metrics and the kind of key KPIs that we're going to use to measure those particular use cases. And then on a more practical level, we'll also talk to some of the subject matter experts about how this use case would actually manifest itself in an organization, but also what resources we might need to have in place For example, have we got the right data to enable that particular use case? Or do we have the right processes and people to ensure we can get the most out of that particular use case? And using that solution envisioning approach, we can then create a prioritized view of your different use cases to give you advice about which use cases to start working on first. We can then support the process of building that up into a business case to kind of document that value proposition and how we can actually start to plan out the delivery of those things, and then wrap all of that up into an AI strategy so that organizations have a joined up and cohesive vision that aligns to their overall objectives, that talks to the way that AI can kind of support organizations on that journey, with things like cost estimates, practical roadmap planning, all included in that to make sure that you've got that end-to-end view of how you can adopt AI. The other kind of key offering I want to talk about is what we call our AI Innovation Hub. And this is kind of our process for helping organizations tangibly get started with AI. You know, how do you get something that you can actually demonstrate to your organization and really start to win over the hearts and minds of your business that you can help people to start adopting with these things? So the AI Innovation Hub essentially builds on the AI Readiness Kickstarter, takes those use cases and applies that prioritized view so we understand which are our most valuable use cases. We can then use our expertise in AI engineering and machine learning delivery, for example, to help build out those pilots, to help us really kind of understand, is this actually a viable AI solution or initiative, or actually is it something that sounded like a good idea but we're not quite ready for yet? So the idea is that we want to allow you to fail fast and waste sort of minimal effort on establishing that sort of feasibility. But for those ones that really are a really good option and have a lot of potential, we want to make sure we can help to accelerate those through to that pilot stage. That's really about understanding how we can very quickly get that pilot up and running to a way that can be demonstrated across the organization. And then as that value case gets more and more proven, we can then help to scale that out into production for whatever that looks like for your organization, starting to take into account such as enterprise scale and security, looking at things like CI/CD and how we might deploy and maintain these artifacts, things like machine learning operations also come into effect as well to make sure that we can manage and maintain that AI initiative over the long term. So the key sort of value propositions or the key value pillars behind this are kind of threefold. So the first thing is being able to manage those use cases, understand what those core business problems are and how they manifest themselves as use cases, building that out into a structured backlog that we continually review and iterate on and start to build out pilots from. The other thing, of course, is then the AI infrastructure, so making sure that we've got that foundational layer in place and those resources there to make sure that we can rapidly develop those use cases and make sure that everything that we need is in place to cover off things like security, governance, all those really important concepts that I talked about at the start of this webinar are in place to make sure that we can scale those out smoothly. And the last thing then, of course, is capability to actually develop these solutions out. So we have tried and tested and proven knowledge about how to develop these particular types of applications, capabilities, and we can use that to help your organization really get started on that journey to adopting AI, using things like our AI accelerator, but also our data platform and our other broader offerings as well. So with that actually concludes the content of this webinar. I believe we have roughly 10 minutes or so for questions. So I would encourage anyone to start putting further questions in the Q&A box if they have them. But I will open up the question and answer bot now.
There was one, but I took the liberty of kind of answering that, but I think you can give a bit more color to it.
Okay, sure. So the question is, so is AI tools for organizational enhancement more about building stuff ourselves that either benefits from or contains AI, whereas AI for commercial use is more about purchasing and using pre-built tools with AI built in rather than building ourselves? So yes, I completely agree with Cindy on that one. I think, yeah, organizational enhancement is really about giving you the opportunity to build out a tool or a capability that is really tailored around your organization. It's about using sort of relatively standard services in Azure and bringing those together in such a way that fits your specific use case. And this is where those things about the sort of success metrics and KPIs come into place, because you as an organization will understand individually what makes this use case valuable, or actually what makes it one of those ones that you might fail fast on. And yeah, conversely, the sort of the organization, the commercial use AI is really your kind of, you get what you're given out of the box. You may have some ability to fine tune some aspect of it, but fundamentally, someone else has built the AI for you, and that is then a value add to that product and service, but doesn't give you the opportunity to really fully build out things that are focused around your organization. Cindy, is there anything you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, for example, so you might have heard about all of the Microsoft Copilots, and the main difference between, gives Matt a chance to chug some water there. Main difference between what we have said is a Copilot versus Azure OpenAI tooling is that Copilot is a bit more hands-off. So it is already built for you. You can utilize the fundamental LLM, so that's usually GPT-4, under the hood, but it is one layer up, whereas Azure OpenAI is really just that deep programmatic tool that you can use to wrangle into exactly what you want. So I think my go-to is usually, can you do it via something like a Copilot first, because there's not necessarily the need to spend R&D, both time and money, into building something that has already been built, so no need to reinvent the wheel. But then if there is something that your company or your organization really needs from a fundamental perspective, how you interact with the large language model. So for example, if you have APIs that already exist, or if you have existing systems that you need to integrate into, this is where I think you would want to go down the customized route of wrangling those large language models through programmatic, whatever your programmatic language is.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Pardeep, for the question. We've got a few other questions here. So we've got one from Suresh. So how will our data be translated into a format that AI can understand? Is it vectorized? So yeah, you've guessed the answer there perfectly, Suresh. So yes, we vectorize data, so essentially create a numerical representation of your content. We store that in a vector database, and that allows us to do our similarity lookups with a bit of filtering as well, and some additional prompt engineering. And that's what allows us to interact with those large language models. Absolutely. And that all goes on in the back end of our AI Solution Accelerator. This is a good one, I think, Cindy, which may be good to bring you in on as well. So how do you control costs on the custom-built copilots? As I assume Gen AI output on a custom-built model is billed per kilo character or similar. Anything you want to come in on that one then?
Yeah, so it depends. So when I think Copilot, I think all of our existing pre-built models. So those are typically licenses, much like the Power BI licenses or a Microsoft 365 license. And basically, if your users are using it, it's per head, for example. But that's the pre-built stuff. The custom-built Copilots, those I would like to categorize as the stuff that you would build, for example, on Azure OpenAI, and those are the ones that you would integrate with your APIs or existing systems. That is billed per 1,000 tokens. At a couple, it's even sub 1 pence per 1,000 tokens, but you can see that racks up a bill quite quickly if you're doing RAG patterns, or you're opening it up to your end users. So if you're hooking it up to a web interface that would allow anyone to access it, right? So that is billed via 1,000 tokens, which is give or take 0.75 words. Hopefully that answers your question, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, just to extend on that as well, from the custom perspective. So obviously there are different model options. So one thing that we would look at is whether you really need, a GPT-4 type model, or actually whether you can get away with something much simpler to cover off your use case. And that then obviously helps with cost optimization, all that kind of stuff. And if that more than covers what you need it to do, then that's great. You can choose a more efficient model that is likely quicker and cheaper to utilize. So finding that right model is really, really important. As Cindy said, these all work on, all these kind of custom Azure OpenAI services work on token count. So anything we can do to start limiting that token count. So what we would start to do is firstly really focusing on the use case. And if the use case is going to be generating volumes and volumes of content, then we'd have to factor that into our cost estimation. But ideally what we want to try and do is utilize different techniques to try and condense the amount of prompts that we're having to push in and the amount of content that we're then passing through that LLM on each iteration. So really thinking about that use case and how we can be more succinct with our prompting essentially to reduce that token count, and that volume usage is really important. And the last thing I think as well, just to sort of take this outside of those custom Azure OpenAI use cases, is that very rarely do those things exist in a vacuum. You won't normally have just an Azure OpenAI component. You'll probably have some sort of vector database, some sort of tool that's going to help you extract information from those documents, like something like Azure Document Intelligence. And those things all have costs associated to them as well. So when you look at these different solutions, it's really important that you look at that holistic view of everything, and not just at the specific large language model as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point there, Matt. I've tossed in the question threads some links to our pricing for Azure OpenAI services, but it's a completely different model. So whereas Copilot is licenses, Azure AI and all Azure services are consumption based. So you essentially pay for how much you actually use without just one monthly flat fee, for example. And so there, like Matt said, there's all kinds of mechanisms that you can use to optimize for the cost point of view. So I think another thing that we advise a lot is if you're serving it up via a website, then you might want to look into something like caching, because caching is going to be a lot cheaper than having to hit OpenAI for a response every single time. So if someone is asking what is an LLM 45 times, you're not going to get billed for all 45 times. You'll get the answer for the first time and then use caches to serve it back up. So those are kind of the things that actually that's my day job. I didn't explain it very well, but essentially Matt and Adatis and I at Microsoft, we are both able to help you architect it in the right way so that it's efficient for your organization and doesn't cost a lot. So yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Cindy. I think that nicely answers that last question there, which is around the Copilot licensing versus Azure AI. So that's perfect. And that is all the questions that we had in our thread. And I believe that takes us almost perfectly up to 1 o'clock as well. So I just want to thank everyone again for joining the webinar today. And I hope that you found that interesting. Special thank you to Cindy for attending and giving us such a fantastic rundown of kind of how we've got to the point of which AI is at the moment. Thank you very much for your time, Cindy. The slides from this will be shared around afterwards to all sort of registered attendees. So you should receive the slides shortly, and please don't hesitate to get in touch if there are any interest in the offerings that I've talked about in the AI Accelerator or any further questions related to generative AI. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.